Leading today's webinar, Packaging EPR for Consumer Products, are Sheila Millar and Anushka Stein of Keller and Heckman. So without further ado, I am pleased to turn the program over to our presenters. Please take it away.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you to the Association for helping host this webinar today. I'm Sheila Millar. I'm a partner at Keller and Heckman. I work on sustainability, EPR, product regulatory, product safety, and marketing and advertising issues, all of which I think come into play when we're talking about EPR. And I'll let Anushka introduce herself.
I'm Anushka Stein, and I'm an associate here at Keller and Heckman, based in our DC office. And I work on environmental and consumer protection issues in the areas that Sheila mentioned. And we're looking forward to sharing our expertise and recent developments in EPR.
Yes, so I'm going to start with a quick standard disclaimer. We are going to talk about the law. We're not here to give you legal advice. The provision of information about the law is not the same thing as legal advice. So please make sure that you understand that distinction. We are going to talk about general information. We are not going to share any, obviously, client confidential information, but we are going to share with you some pointers and thoughts that we have through our lengthy experience in this area. So I want to turn next to what we're going to try to cover on our agenda today. Our focus today is on EPR in the packaging world. In a minute, Anushka is going to try to give you a quick overview of general EPR requirements, because in this sector, you're actually potentially going to be covered by multiple EPR programs. And because our focus today is on consumer brands, consumer products, not packaging for food or food service, which takes up a lot of the oxygen in the room when we talk about EPR, we're going to try to really focus on some of those special considerations for consumer brands. And one of the things we like to keep in mind is that your packaging is an extension of your brand identity. So the type of packaging you might use, for example, to sell high-end jewelry is not going to be the same as the packaging you might use to sell less expensive costume jewelry or fashion jewelry. You may have heavy ring boxes, a box within a box, lots of paper, heavy packaging. But for the fashion jewelry, you may have just a hang tag, or you may have a plastic bag or a cloth bag. So we very much think about, what are you considering as brand owners when you choose packaging? When we go through the EPR questions, and we're going to summarize some of the state laws here, we're going to try to bear that in mind and want you to do the same. We're going to go through Oregon, Colorado, some of the other specific states, and talk about the outlook for additional legislation in the packaging EPR space. And we're going to also share some hypothetical scenarios. We may not have enough time to get into a whole lot of detail, but hopefully a review of some hypothetical scenarios will help you think about how packaging EPR affects your products as consumer brand owners.
It will certainly highlight some of the complexities.
Exactly.
So before we delve into the packaging EPR schemes, we wanted to provide an overview of existing EPR schemes in other contexts, just to show you that EPR is not something new. It's existed for decades in some cases, and new EPR programs are targeting packaging and textiles, which we'll discuss later on. There's also an expansion of existing programs. So when EPR programs first started, the focus was on products that were either difficult to collect for disposal or that would be hazardous if they were disposed in landfill. So examples of the hazardous would be electronics, paint, batteries. Difficult to dispose of mattresses, carpeting can be quite large. So that's why there were EPR programs developed for those materials to help with disposal. We're seeing expansion specifically of EPR programs and similar recycling requirements for electronics and batteries. So some states like to distinguish between an EPR program where the producer has to establish a producer responsibility organization, and that's what we're seeing for all of the packaging laws. But there are also schemes like the bottle bills. So if you're not familiar with what a bottle bill is, if you've ever picked up a bottle or a can and you've seen written like CRV, 10 cents, 5 cents. So that is putting the onus on the consumer. So you're being charged at point of sale. And then if you recycle the bottle or the can, you get your 5 or 10 cents or whatever it may be back. So some states will distinguish between programs where the producer has to pay and programs where the consumer is directly paying. But as we'll discuss a little later on, even in these cases where there's a pro, the cost is being passed on to the consumer anyway, because you might see greater costs to products so that producers can afford to continue operating, basically. So we'll talk about exemptions and exceptions later on, but while we're on this slide, I wanted to point out for the packaging EPR programs, there's going to be a lot of overlap with these other EPR programs, right? Like all of these probably have some form of packaging, but paint and bottle bills are specifically excluded from the packaging EPR programs. And we think that that might be because of how these products are disposed. So once you drink your bottle of water, you throw the bottle away in most cases. Once you've used your paint can, you get rid of the paint can. But for something else like an electronic, you're not disposing of that package at the same time that you're disposing of the electronics. So that might be why some of these are exempt and some are not. Oh, accidentally, sorry. Maybe the clicker is not the right option for me.
Right, it's going backwards.
Okay. So all of these EPR programs, they have some commonalities and some differences, but generally the concept is that the polluter pays, right? And that's going to be true for the packaging EPR programs, but as mentioned earlier, that might not be true for some of the recycling programs where the consumer pays, right? But even in the case of the polluter pays laws, the companies might think that the polluter is actually the consumer.
Right.
So it might not be intuitive to you, but the laws treat the producer of the product as the polluter, unfortunately. So some general EPR trends. So Maryland and Washington are the most recent to pass their packaging EPR programs, and so those laws are pretty similar. But for the other laws, each one is kind of unique, and they have, at first glance, they seem to have the same products covered, but then you'll look at them and they'll be like, oh, the definitions are completely different, and we'll discuss that a little bit later on. But the commonalities include that the onus is on the producer. So the producer, Sheila will discuss who the producer is in a little bit, but that could be the brand owner, the licensee, an importer. It could also be a distributor. It will just depend on the definitions. All of these recognize some sort of exemption, and we'll discuss later on specific exemptions. A common one is an exemption for low volume producers based on global gross revenue, but that will differ. So in Oregon, it's 5 million. So if you produce, so if your global gross revenue, not your state revenue, is 5 million, you could be exempt, or 5 million or less. But in another state like Maryland, it's 2 million. So it will differ. And all of the states also recognize a de minimis exemption for if you introduce less than 1 ton into the state, then you're exempt. And then many of these laws will include recycling rate goals, source reduction goals, PCR content goals, so that's post-consumer recycled content. But the different goals, there will be different goals, and some of the laws might not include all of these.
So as Anishka said, there are now 7 states that have enacted packaging EPR programs. Maine, in order of enactment, I guess, Maine, Oregon, California, Colorado, Minnesota, and lastly, just this year, Maryland and Washington. Several states have also adopted what are called needs assessment laws, or we might characterize them as pre-EPR laws. Maryland was an example of a state that had a needs assessment law, and typically they will ultimately result in some type of packaging EPR bill sooner or later. And the 3 states are Illinois, Hawaii, and Rhode Island. On the right-hand side, for those of you who are legislative watchers, we have a list of some of the proposed bills over the years. And highlighted in blue are states that looked at packaging EPR bills in the past legislative session. As most of you know, legislative sessions differ from state to state. Most states, the legislative sessions are over. But what we see is a history of bills often do not get adopted the first time or the second time or even the 5th time they're introduced. But sooner or later, these bills go through. And so what you see here are states to really keep an eye on for future action in the next legislative session. That by no means means these are the only states where we're likely to see action. And in some states like New Jersey, they already have a version of a rigid plastic container law that requires registration, payment of a fee, but that law is not an EPR law per se. It's a plastic packaging law specifically. So we don't have time today to get into the nuances, but there are other laws besides EPR laws. We're going to focus on the EPR laws that really look at take back, polluter pays types of principles, often involving a third-party producer responsibility organization, but that's not universally the case, as we've seen with the beverage laws that Anushka alluded to earlier.
Yeah, and I will discuss in a little bit how California and Oregon also have an RPPC law. So if New Jersey passes its EPR law, you might see that it's not consistent with their RPPC law, because that's what we've seen with Oregon and California.
Yeah, just to add a little extra confusion to the mix for companies that are trying to facilitate regulatory compliance, this creates an extremely challenging situation because you are faced with compliance obligations for the same category of problem, if you will, packaging, but it hits you in multiple different ways and the costs will mount up accordingly.
Yes. So as discussed earlier, all of these laws cover different types of packaging. At first glance, it might seem that it's the same, but it's not. So, and as Sheila mentioned earlier, this may affect food more than other products. So for example, in Colorado, the statute identified packaging material and paper products. But then when they finalized their regulations, these new subcategories of packaging material were identified: service packaging and unfilled food and beverage packaging material. So service packaging is a particularly interesting, to me at least, category because it has different examples, and some of them appear to be food packaging, right? So packaging for baked goods, food wrap, meat trays, but then they distinguish it with unfilled food and beverage packaging material, which is for food that's ready to be consumed. So there's that distinction, and you need to be aware of that nuance. And basically every state has a different definition for what packaging material is. Paper products is pretty straightforward, but some that we sat in on a panel that had someone from Circular Action Alliance, and Sheila will discuss in a bit about Circular Action Alliance. But they suggested that in some states, like a hang tag is not considered paper products. But when I look at the definition, that's not clear to me. So
But I think that just illustrates that you have to look state by state. It's not just looking at the statutes or the regulations or the guidance from the state, but you also have guidance and interpretations from the PRO. Typically it's the Circular Action Alliance, and there are often some inconsistencies, not just between the legal definitions, but between the interpretations. And sorting through that in terms of trying to figure out how it applies to your business, the types of packaging you use, what constitutes packaging and who a producer is, can not be, it's just not a straightforward issue.
Yes. Exemptions are also not straightforward. So to help compare exemptions, I kind of paraphrased the different exemptions, and you'll see that a lot of these states exempt B2B transactions, but there are nuances to that. So for Colorado, for example, it's packaging materials used slowly in transportation or distribution to non-consumers, packaging materials used solely in business-to-business transactions where a covered material is not intended to be distributed to the end consumer, packaging materials that are not sold or distributed to covered entities. So then you have to figure out who is a covered entity. Packaging materials that are used for products sold or distributed outside of the state. And that's a common exemption. If it's something that's outside of the state, if it's destined to be disposed of outside of the state, it's not going to be covered typically. Oregon explicitly says that in its laws. Some of these don't, but that's the interpretation. And that Colorado definition is different from the definition used by any of these other states. So again, you have to look at each statute, each regulation, and then also the guidance that's provided by the Pro, because we thought something was covered by Oregon, and then a few weeks later, the Pro came out with guidance
Contradicting its earlier guidance that it was covered, saying
Yes.
it's not covered.
Yes, so sometimes it seems like maybe the Pro is responding to questions from its members and realizing that some clarification is needed.
Yeah, and on that point, I think in some of the states, the definition of what's covered, a material that a producer distributes to another producer that's subsequently used to contain a product, and the product is distributed to a commercial business or entity and not introduced to a person other than the commercial or business entity that first received the product, is the definition in Maryland. So that seems like a good B2B exception. In Minnesota, covered material that's excluded is material that a producer distributes to another producer, subsequently used to contain a product, and the product is used and distributed to a commercial or business entity. So you see some commonality in some of these states with this type of definition, but the wordings can differ slightly. So again, each state has to be reviewed independently to look at your obligations. And that's important when we think about who is a producer. As with the as with definitions, as with the exemptions, these definitions vary, but they typically are hierarchical. They tend to be somewhat more complicated in some situations just because the commercial relationships for food packaging and food service packaging, but for consumer brands, it tends to be slightly more straightforward. For non-food products, it's typically the brand owner, and the packaging supplier may or may not be the producer for EPR purposes, depending on branding. So, for example, Colorado, in some updated proposed regulations, describes the producer as the individual or the entity who's directing the manufacturing. And directing the manufacturing means the entity who directs the manufacturing is the party who provides instructions, typically through a negotiated supplier agreement, which establishes the packaging specifications and branding for the package. So what does that mean? For private labelers, if you've got branded products, you may be typically you're going to be the producer. We do see some co-branding situations, and in terms of certain negotiated agreements, if you have a licensing, retailing, distribution agreement, you may affect commercially who is defined as the producer. So it's important to look at the commercial agreements between the parties to determine who is actually the producer. And sometimes even when the producer would be clear from the contract or from the definitions in the state, you can negotiate these things. And so we do see that negotiations are occurring. And for many of the RBCF members, you're typically not going to be able to take advantage of the exemption levels that Anushka described a minute ago, because you're going to be too big and the volumes will be typically too large. So these definitions are important, and as we mentioned earlier, the packaging EPR laws are consistent in establishing a producer responsibility organization, and the PRO in all the states that have identified a PRO is the Circular Action Alliance, or CAA. They're the only PRO in California, Colorado, Oregon, and Minnesota. They represented producers on the advisory council for the pre-EPR legislation, which established a needs assessment process in Maryland. And I think there's every indication that they will be the PRO in Maryland. As I said, the CAA does have interesting and useful guidance. There's some publicly available guidance, but much of the guidance materials are only available to entities that actually register with CAA. And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg. You don't know if you're an obligated producer, but you can't get to a lot of the more relevant information unless and until you register. So it's creating some, I think, questions and concerns within the business community as a result. But there are some useful guidance documents, and you do have to keep up with them, because we have seen instances where, you know, some presentations that were presented on, say, the Oregon law in the spring reached some conclusions that turned out to be addressed differently in the reverse in later guidance that came out, you know, a month or two ago. So important to kind of keep up with that.
So one of the commonalities, or two of the commonalities of all of these laws, is that you have program fees, which are going to be remitted to the PRO, and reporting obligations, which are also typically handled by the PRO. So for reports, you're going to need to report on the type and weight of covered materials for each state. And in some of the regulations, Colorado, for example, there's some language suggesting that even if you're exempt, you have to report, but we're not aware of anyone doing that, and we're not aware of anyone being asked to do that by either the PRO or the state. But once you've submitted your reports, the PRO will use that to set their fee schedules. And as Sheila mentioned, some resources that the PRO publishes are only available to members. The fee schedule, at least in Oregon, is one of those resources. So the final fee schedule in Oregon is only available to registered producers, or if you work for the government, you can take a look at it as well. But this slide sets out some of the different fee rates based on the program plan amendment. So Oregon published 2 different amendments to their program plan. The most recent one was published last week and is open for comment until October 10th. So if you are troubled by some of the fees that you're seeing here, so $1 per pound could be significant depending on how much your packaging weighs, and particularly if you are in the polystyrene business, because that has some of the highest fees outside of packaging for hazardous materials.
And those fee schedules actually for polystyrene, for example, actually went down compared to the proposed fee schedule in the original proposed plan, if I remember correctly. But again, what we're hearing from clients who are participating and who have registered is they're getting some pretty, what I'll call, whopping bills that are relatively surprising in their totals. So it's a huge commercial issue and challenging to plan for as a result.
And because there's not a whole lot of input from producers into how the fee schedule is set, providing comments might be your only opportunity to say something. So that deadline is again October 15th.
Yes, and I think one of the challenges is that because the backstop, the background of how the fees were developed, sort of looking behind the curtain at the Wizard of Oz, as they say, is not public. It's not public at all. You do not have any idea how those fees were developed. It was submitted as confidential information. It's available to the state, but it's not publicly available. And that is an issue of concern because it's hard to actually comment on something where you don't know how those fees were created, how the fee schedule was created.
But the fee schedule is supposed to reflect, I guess, environmentally conscious packaging design. So you can argue that the fee schedule doesn't accurately do that, but that is what it is designed to attempt to do. And then each of these laws also, well, most of these laws also offer other opportunities for eco-modulation. So there are currently rulemakings in progress in California and Colorado, and Oregon's amended program plan recognizes 3 options for obtaining credits against future invoices. So just as an example of maybe this might not even be worth it to you, Colorado's proposed rule, 1% reduction in dues if you put a label describing how the package should be sorted. 1% if your product contains at least 30% Colorado PCR. So for some products, particularly in the food packaging context, but in others as well, like cosmetics, areas where you really want to make sure that your packaging is not going to contaminate your product, it's very hard to find PCR that meets specific metrics and requirements, and this just adds another layer, all at a 1% benefit.
Well, and plus, if you have to put a tag on it or a label on it, it may actually be an additional separate piece of packaging for which a separate fee is imposed.
Yeah, so, you might want to avail yourself of 1% reduction here, but maybe just forget about the 1% there.
Right.
So most of these are just going to give you a 1% reduction, except you can get a 10% reduction if you reduce the liquid contained in your package or instruct a consumer to dilute the product or use less of it. So that's Colorado. In Oregon, they're going to give you different bonuses, which look a little bit better. So it's, well, at first glance, so 10% of applicable base fees if you perform a life cycle assessment, but there's a cap of $20,000. And as Sheila mentioned, some of our clients have gotten sticker shock, and so is $20,000 really gonna, because an LCA can be very expensive to conduct.
Right. It can cost you way more than $20,000 to do an LCA. And then when you're talking about an array of different types of packaging where the LCA inputs are going to be different, it's a additional cost. So the incentives or malices, so the incentives are the positive benefits or maybe bonuses or reductions in the fees. Malices are additional fees, higher fee schedules. So both of those things are in play and still to be determined because they're part of the proposed amended plans in Oregon and Colorado.
Yeah, and one point about these LCAs, so they're supposed to be used by the top 25 largest producers in Oregon, and a list of those was published earlier, and it's subject to revision based on additional data that they might get, but it's up there, and these 25 largest producers have to evaluate and disclose impacts of 1% of their products on a biannual basis. And then Oregon also has a bonus B that also LCA you can avail yourself of, and then a new bonus C in the amended plan if you introduce reusable or refillable formats.
But also, I think there's some guidance that talks about the reusable, refillable. If you are using mail-in programs, you've got to count the packaging that goes to mail something to the consumer. So when you're thinking strategically about your packaging portfolio, you want to think about the suite of obligations and what the totality of the packaging would be, the different types of materials that you're using, the different fee schedules, to determine which approaches will both enhance your sustainability position, help you positively position your brands, potentially address claims that you want to make, but also, most importantly, help you minimize and reduce the EPR fees that you're paying in the different states.
So take a look at some of the program metrics that are set out in the laws and regulations. And some of these are still not final. Those 4 states that are still working on those are listed below. But let's start with California. So their EPR program has source reduction requirements that are set out on the slide. And so source reduction means reducing the amount of packaging. It also establishes minimum recycling rates, which are on the slide. And then minimum post-consumer recycled content is not established under the EPR law, but it is established by the rigid plastic packaging container law, which we addressed earlier. So that's going to apply to containers that are 8 fluid ounces to 5 gallons that are rigid and meet some other criteria. Oregon, as I mentioned earlier, also has an RPPPC law, but for products in California that are RPPCs and also covered by the EPR law, which the hypotheticals will discuss that you might be covered by both, you might be covered by just one, it will depend. But if you are covered by the RPPC law, you have to have at least 25% post-consumer recycled content or demonstrate source reduction by at least 10%. So there's some overlap with the EPR requirements here. Or you have to be reusable or refillable, but the definitions under the RPPC law for reusable and refillable are narrower than what is provided for in the EPR law. So for an RPPC, if it's reusable, it has to be reused for a different purpose than its original purpose. So a soap dispenser that you're putting soap back into, that's not considered reusable under the RPPC law, but it probably would be considered reusable under the EPR law. So if you are both an RPPC and you'll just have to keep that in mind, that you're reusable under one but not the other. Refillable, the product manufacturer has to have a system in place for sending the product back and refilling it. But as Sheila mentioned, there can be additional packaging involved in that. So another consideration. And it's a similar situation in Oregon, which has its own PCR rates, its own recycling rates, which are also set out both in the EPR law and the RPPC law. So you'll have to consider both of those again. And then Maine, so we've sent out the source reduction, the recycling rate, and the PCR requirements on the slide, but Maine goes beyond that. So they have reuse goals, 15% from 2030 to 2039, and then beginning in 2050, 50% reusable goals. And reusable there means packaging that is designed to be reused, and the reuse is facilitated by a collection program. So again, they have their own definition. And then they also require that covered materials be readily recyclable, reusable, or compostable, 50% by 2030, 75% by 2040, and 100% by 2050. And then they also have litter rates. And then Minnesota by 2032, all packaging, food packaging, and paper products have to be refillable supported by a refillable system, or reusable, managed through a reuse system, recyclable and collected through a curbside or alternative system, compostable. So various requirements that you're going to have to meet in all of these different states. They're different. And then in California, not set out here, but they're going to require every single-use packaging and plastic foodware covered by the law to be recyclable or compostable by 2032. And we'll discuss shortly how that can be complicated to meet as well.
For Colorado, just very quickly, there's been some recent action that would be of interest to you to follow up on. Just last week on August 14th, the Colorado's Producer Responsibility Advisory Board submitted an approval recommendation memo in support of the Circular Action Alliance's amended program plan. There are a lot of interesting facets of that, but we wanted to just call out a couple of points. The PCR targets are one. And we have on the slide some of the PCR targets that are at issue. But the complicated question of how to achieve those goals is addressed at a high level in the amended plan. And those include segregation of recycled content, controlled blending, mass balance, rolling average, or mass balance credit methods, excluding book and claim, which maybe some of you are familiar with. This idea and the reference to mass balance has a link to advanced recycling, which is a very important component of the plastics recycling universe. But was interesting that the advisory board, although it generally recommended supporting the amended plan, said the board has expressed significant concern that the mass balance credit with free allocation method, all of these would exclude material that goes to fuel, chain of custody method may not provide certainty and transparency needed to verify that, first of all, PCR claims reflect actual PCR content, and secondly, PCR reported levels aren't including claims generated by material used as fuel. I think that comment suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of chemical recycling, advanced recycling, because the whole point is that you're going to be looking at an allocation method, similar to what you're doing in looking at allocating, sustainable palm oil or cocoa production for certain types of food uses. And because you cannot assure that there will physically be that amount of material in the product. So for those of you who are interested in and supportive of advanced recycling, that's maybe a issue to highlight in comments if you're interested in commenting on these questions. If we look at the next slide.
Just a point, so on the point of advanced recycling, so Oregon also has its amended program plan out, and in that amended plan, they describe how they are going to verify the end market goals that they have, and they explicitly say that they assume that nothing is going to non-mechanical recyclers. So they're pretty much excluding advanced recycling and the assumptions.
And I think it's less of an issue for consumer brands than for food contact and food service applications, where you definitely have to meet certain purity levels. But we know that for many types of industries who are looking at improving recycled content rates for a variety of different products, they're speccing food grade material or even sometimes medical grade material. And so the idea of the potential for contamination and the reason you would spec food grade material is to get that higher purity level, which may not be assured of getting that clean stream that you would need to satisfy food contact types of requirements. So just real quickly, the metrics in the Colorado law have collection and recycling rate targets, fairly straightforward. If we move to the next slide, we'll just say a quick word about California rather. California was interesting. I think everybody knows that they were poised to finalize their regulations, but under the California process, rules have to go through an approval by the governor, and the governor disapproved the proposed rules, so sent them back to the drawing board. One problem is that the governor doesn't have the authority to change statutory deadlines, so those statutory deadlines remain. But again, just last week was a pretty busy week. On August 14th, Colorado started their rulemaking process, and on August 15th, CalRecycle started or announced that the public comment process for the updated SB 54 draft regulations will be opening later on this month. And so we look at both the, and Anushka's going to talk about this in a minute, in California, CalRecycle has done a material characterization study related to what materials are collected, recycled, et cetera, for purposes of the EPR law SB 54. But they've done a separate material characterization study in the state under California SB 343, which is their Recycling Claims Act. So again, I think the states are, legislators are adopting different legislation for slightly different purposes with some overlap, and it is extremely frustrating that they are not coordinating, and we end up with two different studies for essentially almost the same identical purpose. This is relevant because as we're talking about improving PCR content rates, source reduction, possible moves to refillable or reusable packaging, all of that affects claims. So we did want to say a quick word about California SB 343, which is going to affect, in particular, recyclable claims, and AB 1201, which is going to affect compostable claims.
Yeah. And my apologies to be interrupting you at this point, but I just wanted to let you know we have about 20 minutes left of the presentation, but we do have some questions in the queue in case you want to leave a time for those at the end.
Yep.
Thank you.
We will.
So just at a high level, we've highlighted SB 343 beginning for products manufactured after October 4th, 2026 is going to restrict recyclability claims for those products. So if you have a product that was manufactured before that date, you can pretty much ignore it, but you do still have to meet national criteria for recyclability. But for products that are going to be subject to the SB 343 restriction, basically any implication that the product is recyclable, unless it meets statewide recyclability criteria, is going to be deemed deceptive or misleading. So what are those criteria? So you have to be collected by programs that serve at least 60% of the population of the state. And so this is for curbside specifically. There are certain exemptions. So if you have your own take back program, you're still going to be subject to 60% right now, but that is going to increase in 2030. So you'll just have to keep an eye on that. But if you are curbside, you have to be collected at 60%. You have to be sorted at 60%. You also have to show that there are actual end markets, but then you can't have any components, inks, adhesives, or labels that prevent recyclability. And the law specifically points to EPR guidance on that point.
And EPR is the Association of Plastic Recyclers.
Mm-hmm. And you can't have intentionally added chemicals identified under other California laws. You can't have PFAS that is intentionally added or has a functional or technical effect or that exceeds 100 parts per million. So a couple different requirements that differ from the national criteria, which is, still that you have to be collected at 60%, sorted, and actually be recycled. The California law adds a lot more, and a lot of products that are currently considered recyclable will no longer be considered recyclable.
And California AB 1201 restricts compostable and home compostable claims. The most notable feature was that effective January 1st, the law would have required the resulting compost to meet national organic program standards of USDA. And fortunately, the state has deferred that deadline in a letter to BPI. Compostability is probably less important for the consumer brands and for food service. So we wanted to just say a quick word about another big development in Oregon, which is a lawsuit filed a few weeks ago challenging the constitutionality of the Oregon EPR law. They allege, among other grounds, that this law involves an unconstitutional delegation of authority to a private entity. They allege several federal constitutional grounds. Interestingly, the lawsuit was filed on behalf of the National Association of Wholesalers and Distributors. They did not ask for a stay or a temporary injunction, and so it will not stay the particular requirements. So if we move to the next slide, we have here just a recap of some of the important deadlines. And as we said at the outset, if we go to the following slide, the outlook for new legislation is pretty clear. We've talked about the nascent textile EPR scheme in California. There are a lot of focus on batteries as well. But we did want to spend just maybe 5 minutes talking about maybe one of our hypothetical examples here, so we allow some time for questions. So I think, Anushka, maybe we'll pick example 2. This is an example of a plastic bin that's filled with other products, some of which are also in plastic containers, pump spray types of containers, other types of containers. There's some plastic wrappers in there. So let's talk about what products are covered. So first of all, when we think about these issues, we think about, is this something that somebody is putting together, or is this the product, and then within the product there are different items of packaging?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this hypothetical, we could think about 2 different hypotheticals. So hypothetical 2 could be split up to 2 hypotheticals. So in option A, this product is sold as is, except those tablets, which, so this is a stock photo, so you can imagine whatever you want here.
It's a little makeup.
Yeah. I was thinking
sponge.
that they were like things that you put in the bath and they fizz up or something.
Right, or they
like
could
that.
be bath, yeah.
So maybe those would be packaged in paper or plastic. They're going to go into that bin. That whole thing is going to be packaged with cellophane wrap with a little bow. So what's going to be packaging there? So the wrap, that plastic wrap, that's going to be packaging. That bow, is that going to be packaging? Yes.
Yes.
And then everything inside, so the glass bottle, the plastic bottles, any additional wraps, that's going to be packaging. That brush is probably the only thing that's not going to be packaging. The bin may or may not be considered packaging. It probably would be considered an RPPC, and depending on the size of some of these bottles, they might also be RPPCs.
So the RPPC laws usually have a minimum 8-ounce container. So some of these are going to be too small, but the bin, so let's assume that the bin is on the shelf. You can pull off just the bin. It's not packaged in anything. It's a product. It's not a package, arguably, but it is a container. And so illustrates the importance of thinking about which laws apply. You're not going to just think about EPR, but you're going to think about other potentially applicable requirements that affect the containers that you are selling. Going back to Anushka's comment about SB 343, the other link is to the resin identification code if you're offering plastic products. So the typical original design of the plastic resin identification code had what we call a triangle of arrows. That will no longer be permitted to be used. No type of arrow design or recycling symbol can be used on any type of container that doesn't meet California's definition of recyclable under SB 343, recognizing that they actually are at pains to say, whatever we've done in our material characterization study does not conclusively establish that this material is recyclable or not. And so it is a complex landscape. And when we think about the, say the box, the next example, number 3, where clearly you have packaging and you have different components with paper box, tissue wrapping, you may have a hang tag on the product, which may or may not now be packaging or not.
Yeah.
Or it may be covered as paper under some of the state laws. So just these couple of examples, I think, have illustrated what some of the questions will be. And we have a toy example there, a candy dispenser with a toy kind of combination. So the permutations of packaging are pretty broad. And we're happy to talk to folks who want to ask us about their particular packaging combinations if that would be useful. So if we go to our next slide, so we have some time for questions. We know that this is a complex area, and we have a few suggestions to think about. It is a very monumental task to monitor all these different EPR requirements. I don't think even AI engines can keep up with all of the changes. There's a lot of discussion about joining a pro. Circular Action Alliance and the states are saying join a pro. But I think for businesses who aren't sure if they are the producer, there are lots of questions about whether or not they should join a pro. What we do know is that EPR is prompting a lot of claims, and so it is important to back up your claims, be sure you can support any claims. We're working with a number of clients in terms of looking at design, sourcing, considering the suite of laws. Again, if you focus only on EPR, you may be missing certain obligations that are established under other laws. And clearly there are a number of industry groups, depending on what types of material is being used, that are, in addition to joining these EPR programs and focusing on these fees, are working hard to enhance recyclability of other materials, because recyclability and meeting these recyclable metrics will be increasingly important over the next few years. We want to maybe spend a couple of minutes on some questions. Patricia, if you want to go back to the queue and talk through a few questions in our remaining 5 minutes or so.
Of course, I'd be glad to. All right, so first up, we have that CAA stated that hang tags on garments needed to be reported in Colorado. Is this not correct?
So all of the written guidance that we've seen suggests that hang tags are included. But then when I went to this panel, a representative from CAA said it's excluded. So some inconsistent guidance from them, but the written guidance is probably what we should look to at this point. And then if CAA says, no, you don't need to include it, then, but this also highlights an issue of, producers are being required to figure out all of these different packages. And then if you have a hang tag, you have to figure out the type and weight of it. So this is kind of a confusing area.
If you are a registered producer, then that is certainly a point of discussion that you could have with CAA. And I think, as Anushka said, the potential for folks speaking on behalf of CAA to maybe make comments that don't align with written guidance, I would certainly look primarily to the written guidance, which, as Anushka said earlier, is where we would focus on.
Yeah, I think the question was about Colorado. So that panelist was addressing Oregon. But if you look at the Oregon statute and regulations, there's no indication that hang tags aren't included.
Right. Yeah, I think we've assumed that they are included because they are a type of package. They are single use. They're going to typically be discarded and serve in effect as a type of label. If you have children's sleepwear, you're going to have tight fitting guidance. You know, you're going to have certain things on your apparel or other products that might be relevant. So that's I think all we can say about that. Do you have another question?
Apologies. Yes, I do. If a company licenses its brand to another party that does the actual packaging and selling, who is considered the obligated producer under EPR laws, and what responsibilities would the brand owner carry?
It's the entity who directs the manufacturing. So typically it is the licensor, the brand owner, who would be primarily responsible. There may be some situations where you have co-branding, or whether under your agreement you are licensing certain rights. But typically for trademark purposes, in order to retain your trademark rights, you need to control your brand. And if you don't, you may risk losing your brand. And so the typical agreement is going to give the brand owner final approval on the artwork, if not the specifications for the packaging itself. For a licensing situation or a packer type of situation, maybe for a household cleaner, I think it's going to be the brand name. So you may have a situation where you have a product that goes into a bottle, and then the label is applied, but the label that's applied has the brand owner's name on it. That brand owner is typically going to be the obligated producer.
And this is sort of the general analysis. For food service packaging, it's a little bit different.
Right.
So you're going to have to look at what is the specific product, and then what is the state, and then kind of determine it from there.
But for consumer brands, it's going to typically be the hierarchy of the manufacturer, the private labeler, the owner of the brand whose name is on the package is going to be the obligated producer. Now, one different situation might be, if I go back to my jewelry example, you have a jewelry box, right? It's just a stock box, but you're using it to put your, $50,000 engagement diamond in the box that goes in a fancy box that, so you're going to look at what that means, and those issues, those products may not have any brand identity on them. So in that case, the obligated producer might be the packaging supplier, but these are all negotiated, and I think at the end of the day, the goal is that somebody takes responsibility for the brand.
Excellent, and thank you very much. And we have time for just one final quick question, and that's, do you have any general next steps advice for mail order companies that sell a large variety of food and non-food products into 48 contiguous states, both self-produced and products others have produced?
I think, and you can weigh in, Anushka, as well, I'd start with an audit of the packaging that you're using. There are different rules for food, food service versus consumer products. And so I think what we've told companies, and we know that companies are working on their internal audits to get a handle on all of their products. It's also important that because the fees are by weight, that you look at weight of each component, because each material is treated differently. So if you're selling cosmetics in glass jars with a plastic liner, maybe a plastic lid in a paper box, you've got 3 basic different materials, and maybe you have an applied plastic label around the jar. So kind of a complex type of situation. And we know that companies are looking at new designs of packaging to improve recyclability, reduce weight, and still maintain the package. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, packaging has to protect the contents. If it doesn't do that, then it's not an effective packaging. Anushka and I were speaking yesterday at another event and for some consumer types of products. You also have to be careful if you're lightweighting your packaging, depending on, I have a water bottle here, but let's say I have some caustic cleaners. If I'm lightweighting the package, but it's going to fail a drop test, the seams are going to split and I'll have spillage or something. You have to think about safety and implications to the user community. So not a simple task. And I think it's really important to know, know what packaging you're using, figure out why you're using it, look at the lowest hanging fruit on where you can reduce packaging or enhance recycling, compostability, whatever, in order to help manage that packaging extended producer responsibility obligations.
Yeah, but I think in terms of immediate next steps, you will first want to figure out if you are a producer.
Right.
And then if you are, you should register for the states where you are, because the reporting obligations are for the prior year. So even if you make changes now, it's not going to affect the fact that you have to report on last year.
Right. And I think the other problem is that if you have complex licensing arrangements, because you're reporting on last year's data, you can't go back and undo your commercial agreements from last year. And it's August. So this year is more than halfway over. So you really need to think strategically about how you're managing your operations, but you have to start with knowing your products, knowing how to protect your products, knowing the types of packaging, and working with your procurement people, because you're sourcing packaging. So you're going to have to get a handle on the weight of the different packaging components that you're using.
And I think we're at time, so.
Yeah. So Patricia, I think we're out of time here. But do you want to we want to just say thank you to all the participants, and thank you, Patricia, again. Our contact information is on the screen. So we hope this has been helpful, and look forward to seeing some of you again at our upcoming programs.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. And also attendees, we will be sending you links to the on-demand version of this webinar and the presentation deck just as soon as those files are available. And we will also include in that email contact information about today's presenters and another complimentary webinar that they have coming up in the near future. Thank you all and have a great day.